Hello and welcome. I am the Restless Kaiser and we are modelling for advantage. During the lockdown, I decided it was time to look at some of the longer term projects, some of the things that I really wanted to do. And I decided it was time that we built a gaming board. We use mats and we use some bespoke assembled boards from various sort of lay-on bits of scenery in some of our games. One of the things I've never liked is how hills, for example, on top of a mat are completely different. I've never liked that. So I thought if we build a board and we flock it using a system, we can make hills and we can make bits of terrain using exactly the same flock blends, so the board should fit together really nicely. So we went to a timber yard, we got some 12mm MDF and some 1-inch battens and had them cut to 4-foot size to make this board. We screwed them together, and in the process of doing so, I actually blistered my finger. It's healed now, but as we were screwing it in, I went to check if it was flush, but forgot that, you know, a drill on the screw meant the screw head was extremely hot, and I had a lovely screw thread blister on this finger for about a week. With that done, the first step was to prepare the surface for the material that was going to go on top of it. I'm not quite sure of the reasons why, but I've taken a lot of my advice from Mel, the Terrain Tutor, and you can check out a link to his channel in the What's It's. He's got some really useful tips there. But one of the things that he recommends is that you water down your filler, your plaster, your cork, and just put a coating of that all over the board. I think it's something to do with the way the MDF reacts to moisture and the material that's going to go on top of it. Unfortunately, Mrs. Kaiser was still learning how to use the DSLR camera, and her concepts of in focus and not in focus were not strongly developed at that stage. So you probably can't see very much of what's going on here, but it's essentially me putting that thin layer of plaster and water. If you're in the UK, you can buy plaster, you can mix your own, or you can just go to the pound shop and buy the tubs like I've used here. They're very, very cheap. I'm sure there's something similar in the United States. It's just pre-mixed filler. Just use that, it's so much easier. Little bit of water in the top, 4-inch brush in there, splodge, off you go. So with that done, we're going to apply some texture to the board. Now it's important that we don't go too mental with this because we're planning to use lay-on terrain. I'm not building a sculpted landscape here. I'm building a board, not in modular tiles, but one that I'm going to use lay-on scenery, but just scenery that matches. So I want some texture, but I don't want it crazy. So to get that texture, I'm using my filler again, but you can see that I've mixed it in a tub with a little bit of PVA, a little bit of water, and a little bit of paint. And I'm using the paint in there to sort of to stop it from being white, which will help with the painting later, but also to kind of help me judge the consistency a little bit. I've just put it in a bit of Tupperware, shaking it up, and as you can see, I'm painting this on and I'm spackling it. I'm not spackling it intensively, and I'm not going to do a lot of this, but it's going to give me a little bit of unevenness. If I was being careful, I would have taped off the edges of the board, and on reflection, I probably should have done that with a little bit of masking tape. Wrapped around my belly in this video is my apron. Of course, a lot of people these days don't find things like aprons and warehouse coats very fashionable. I'm a big fan of an apron when I'm painting or modelling, because it's like having a towel that goes with you everywhere and nobody complains when you cover it with plaster or glue or something. You can see as I'm going through this, the paintbrush itself is starting to clag up a little bit with all that filler. There will be from time to time you might need to go and give it a rinse. Be aware though that the wife isn't home, because this is what happens to your sink when you do so. So we've got a basic texture underneath that, and you can do that twice, and you probably should if you really want to get it, but bearing in mind that this is not something that we're just going to use as is. We're going to add some more material, and as you can see now I've mixed up some PVA and a lot of water, and I'm just painting it on, and I'm going to grit the whole board, and that's going to really give it much more texture. You might want to add a little bit of flow improver. I've used washing up liquid, although you can buy pro ones. One thing that I had overlooked is that using washing up liquid as flow improver and then shaking it vigorously did make it all quite frothy. So I divided the board up into sort of sections in my mind, sort of 9-inch squares or whatever, as I was applying the material. So once I got a bit of glue down, I started gritting it. Now the grit I'm using here is bird sand, and why I'm using that instead of sand is it's not all exactly the same size. You'll see there's smaller and larger pieces of grit within this. This I thought was particularly providing a more natural look to what it is that I'm doing, although it does take a little bit more PVA to soak it up. In terms of how I'm applying it, again, you can see I tried applying it from the bag and it wasn't really working because of the loose bag. As I'm scattering the material around the board, I'm not spreading it evenly. That's quite deliberate. I'm trying to create patchy areas. No areas that are completely bare, but certainly a spread. You're trying to create that ground undulation by the scatter of this material. Continue with that process until you've done the whole board. Be mindful of any stuff you get around the edges. Try and clear it off while the PVA is still wet. I didn't do that as much as I wanted to, but trying to scrape it off later is going to cause you problems. So we're 2 days into the project now. If there's an issue with this particular project, it's the drying time. I put my plaster down and spackled it, and I left it overnight to dry. I put my grit down and I left it overnight to dry. So we'll come back to this on the 3rd day, and we're going to mix up again some PVA and water, and we're going to cover that whole thing. I'm going to spritz it to get the material. This PVA is going to soak up from underneath the watered down PVA, but we need to seal this layer because as we try and paint it, it's all going to want to move around. It's not going to be glued down firmly, so we'll put some glue that's soaked up from underneath and some from on top. The reason we're watering down the PVA is to help it soak. Again, I made the mistake with the washing up liquid using this flow improver, which meant it all came out quite frothy. But this was quite time consuming. I probably could have done with a heavier duty spray. Another day or another overnight experience for it to dry. Might even be worth leaving it for 2 depending on the conditions where you are. And now we're going to paint it, and hopefully that grit isn't going to move around. Again, I'm going to mix up some paint. I'm going to use it quite thin, not super thin, but I'd rather have multiple coats and make sure it soaks through and covers properly. I do make a mistake here in trying to mix the paint with the paintbrush, which has just got it sloshing all over the place. I really should have poured it into a container and shook it up for that. I'm using a mixture of just cheap acrylic paint, mostly brown but with a little bit of black just to darken it, so I can use the same paint later and add some basic highlights. And as you would expect, just go around the table painting it. If when you try to paint it some of that grit is coming off more than just the very occasional bit, then it's not properly adhered and it isn't going to continue to adhere. You need to stop, go back and respray it with your watered down PVA. The thinner your paint is here, the easier it's going to go on this heavily textured surface. You're definitely going to need to paint it more than once if you've got it quite thin, but it is going to really help. As you get to the end of that and you look back, you're going to see some areas where the paint hasn't taken so well. Maybe it was a bit too thin at that point or whatever, and you can see just go back and just dab it. Just touch it up, because you really don't want to have to do this more than twice. The great thing about paint is it didn't take overnight to dry, so at this point I've been around the battening around the edge of the board and just scraped off any of the grit and so forth that is stuck there, and I'm painting it black. It's going straight onto timber, so it's going to take 2 coats, but I felt I needed to get at least 1 down now. I could do it a lot tidier once the whole thing was finished, because again we were going to have some flock and other materials get on there, but I wanted to put my first couple of coats down on that. It's nice the board's starting to look like a playing surface that you might actually be able to use. We didn't stop here, I've got the flocking to do, but it's starting to be realistic. So as you get to the flocking, we return again to the wisdom of Mel, the Terrain Tutor, and he talked about the Premier range from JV Scenics and how that flock, the paint isn't fixed, and what that means is when you blend the 2 flocks together, they bleed a little bit into each other. And this is really useful for creating a more natural effect, because the colours will blend just a little bit. They do 3 basic colours, which you can see here, and what you're doing primarily is I'm going to use the mid-tone one, is going over the whole board, but I'm going to sprinkle on first some of the dark and some of the light. Now normally, if you're building a piece of scenery, you'll have the dark bits in the shadows and the light bits on the raised areas, but of course this board, it doesn't have really raised areas or whatever, so we're trying to create a blend. One of the things that I did realise in doing this is a little bit like when painting a camouflage pattern, and I realised this as I was partway into the project, it gets a more natural feel if you mix the colours one over the top of the other like you would with a camouflage pattern. Rather than having a bit of dark here and a bit of light there, have a bit of dark intersected with a bit of light, and then the mid-tone kind of partially covering all of it. That was just a little bit of a lesson learned, and as the thing dried and those colours bled into one another, the whole thing looked a lot more natural. At the stage where I'm just putting little bits on, it looks a little bit strange as it's going on with these patchy bits, but you can see that I've put the mid-tone over the top of most of it, just to differing degrees. Because this is going to be a wargaming surface and it's going to get a lot of wear, we are going to need to seal it after this, but I have put it on fairly thick. In my initial experiments I put it on a little bit too thin and had to go back. It looked okay when it was powdered, but once it soaked up the PVA and dried again, it was just a little bit bare looking. I also divided it up into sections, doing so that the PVA that I'd put down, the watered down PVA, was still wet when I was applying it. That's really important that it soaks through, obviously. So I realised at this point to try and recreate the bit I mentioned before about the sort of darker towards the shadowed bits and lighter in the centre. But I did think about where I was placing those darker and lighter tones. I did kind of put more of the darker towards the edge of the board and more of the lighter towards the centre of the board. But that was something that I kind of realised a little bit later. And I'm still not quite sure whether it was the way I wanted. Unfortunately, we are missing a video segment here. It didn't work. We had to mist over the whole thing with watered down PVA after waiting another day, and that was the point at which the board really started to come to life. But as I looked at it, I still felt it wasn't quite how I wanted, so I had another go with some more of the flock just to thicken it up in areas and just to mix the tones a little bit. And finally, just as we were coming out of the lockdown, Jonny B got to come round and see this thing as it was still drying. Because of the PVA that we put in the watered down PVA, it was actually still a little bit damp after a day, and we got the hairdryer out and had a bit of a go at it. This might have worked if we'd done this for an hour or two, but in the end we just decided to leave it for a couple more days, and in the end I'm fairly happy with the results. It did take a long time, not because of the individual components and how much work was involved, but because there was so much drying time between the layers. I would also say at the end of this, it hasn't gone perfectly because there's a 1 inch, the whole thing is a little bit bowed. Even though we battened it, and I thought that that would prevent that from happening, I think if I did it again, I might need to batten it on both sides, just kind of reinforce it a little bit. But I'm pretty happy with the results. That's about all from me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you'd seen, why don't you come check us out on modelingforadvantage.co.uk. There's loads of different ways you can support the channel over there, including merch, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it looks gorgeous, but
There's lots of material there.
Contain the moisture quite a bit.
Yeah. I'm thinking we need to leave it another day, John.
I